Assalamu alaikum and welcome to The Report with me, Yasmin Khatun. Tonight's top story looks at a speech earlier today from Prime Minister David Cameron speaking in Birmingham. It was his most extensive yet on the issue of extremism here in Britain. In the speech, the Prime Minister set out what he called a 5-year strategy for countering extremism, announcing among other things that parents worried that their children may travel to Syria or Iraq will be able to apply for their child's passport to be cancelled. He also attacked the National Union of Students for its alleged support of advocacy organisation CAGE and accused university staff that are too culturally sensitive as a reason extremist speakers are invited to speak. We'll be discussing reactions to that speech in a moment, but first let's listen to some of what he had to say.
I also want us to go much further in dealing with this ideology in our prisons and online. We need to have a total rethink of what we do in prison to tackle extremism. And we need our internet companies to go further in helping us identify potential terrorists online. Let us also recognise we'll have to enter some pretty uncomfortable debates, especially cultural ones. Too often, we've lacked the confidence to enforce our values for fear of causing offence. So as part of our extremism bill, we're going to introduce new, narrowly targeted powers to enable us to deal with these facilitators and cult leaders and to stop them peddling their hatred. We'll also work to strengthen Ofcom's role, to enable us to take action against foreign channels that broadcast hate preachers and extremist content. We're now going to actively encourage the reforming and moderate Muslim voices. This is a significant shift in government approach.
Okay, joining me in the studio now to discuss what we've just seen, Cerie Bullivant from advocacy group CAGE, political commentator John Wight, and on Skype Abdur Raheem Green, chairman of iERA. Cerie, I'm going to come to you first. I've got a quote here, which is directly talking about CAGE. So the Prime Minister said, when you choose to ally yourselves with an organisation like CAGE, which called Jihadi John a beautiful young man and told people to support the jihad in Iraq and Afghanistan, it really does, in my opinion, shame your organisation and your noble history of campaigning for justice. What are your reactions to that?
Well, I think first things first, the Prime Minister there has intentionally maligned us. But it's good to know that he takes his news from the Daily Mail, because that's about as deep as his analysis goes there. CAGE has spoken out very clearly on the Emwazi issue. When we did our press conference, we were very clear that Asim was speaking about the man that he knew in 2010. And he even said in that press conference, I can't understand how the man I knew, who, as he said, was beautiful, became this man who's doing these horrific crimes. So we, right from the beginning, were saying that Jihadi John, Mohammed Emwazi, for the crimes that he's committed, should be tried as a war criminal for killing innocent civilians. But the fact that we need to look at is how did he get from being a man who was seeking a job, seeking marriage, seeking a life, to Jihadi John, the character that we all know. And that's the question that the government doesn't want to look at.
Brother Abdur Raheem, I want to come to you before I go to John now, as another Muslim-led organisation who have often stood on podiums with CAGE. You've spoken at various events where you've both been at together. What did you make of those comments?
Well, I always get worried whenever the government talks about narrowly targeted legislation, it ends up never being narrowly targeted at all. I'm sure lots of people will recall various councils across the country using spying, certain things for spying on ordinary people that was actually supposed to be part of narrowly targeted counter-terrorist legislation. And that's the problem with all of this legislation. It ends up being used against all sorts of people. And as for CAGE, I mean, you know, we have in iERA, we have been trying to open up the floor to debate. You know, we've been told by the government that we need to be debating and that we need to, even they're introducing proposals at universities where speakers will only be allowed, certain extremist speakers will only be allowed if there is someone there to challenge them. Well, you know, we've created these platforms with our Don't Hate debate. And unfortunately, the people who are least forthcoming have been from the government themselves. It seems they don't actually want to come out and debate anything. That's, of course, their privilege. They can stand from their privileged platform of government and pass laws and legislation and not have to really engage with people on any real level. And Cameron can give speeches like that, unfortunately, without anyone really challenging them. So it's very unfortunate. It's very unfortunate speech, and I hope none of it materializes into reality.
Okay, John. Now, this doesn't actually affect the law itself. We know over the last 5 years we've seen certain counter-extremism measures come into force, but what do you make of this strategy?
Well, it's certainly creating an environment that's going to make it very, very difficult for Muslims and the Muslim community to play a full part in social and political life in this country, further alienating them. I mean, this is a speech that could have been written by ISIS. Rather than reduce radicalisation, it's going to actually increase it. And people watching or listening to this speech will be wondering, why are they targeting an entire Muslim community? Because what it does is it reduces an entire community of 2 million people into one homogenous mass.
But is he targeting this entire Muslim community? I mean, he says there are so many strong, positive Muslim voices being drowned out by extremists.
Yeah, but I think that was just a caveat. I think the focus of the speech was on culture, was on ideology. The inference is that there's something inherently retrograde within the Muslim community, and you have to understand this in the context of deflection. I mean, the last terrorist attack that took place in Tunisia a couple of weeks ago, when 38 tourists were slaughtered, 30 of them British, in a horrible irony in the same week as the 10th anniversary of 7/7, that emanated from Libya. There were no terrorist training camps in Libya until Britain participated in the NATO air campaign in 2011, which sent the country into an abyss.
Kerry, what do you make of that when the Prime Minister is saying there are so many strong, positive Muslim voices being drowned out?
Well, there are, and he's the one drowning them out. He's bringing in counter-extremism legislation. He talks about wanting debate, but the legislation is specifically designed to silence dissent, to silence any debate, to silence any right of people to hold an alternative viewpoint. And he brings in huge, broad, orthodox concepts like that of Khilafah, for example. And we're not talking about ISIS there. We're talking about the broad concept of a unity within Muslims, something that Europe strives to have with the European Union and ever greater political unity. But yet, when Muslims talk about it, it's a dangerous thing. And it's worth remembering that ISIS is to the Khilafah what the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea is to democracy.
Kaleem, strong words there. Now, one of the things that you speak about a lot, and you've come on previously on our programme and said this about extremist ideology. This came up again in today's speech, where the Prime Minister said the root cause is the extremist ideology itself. Hasn't this been proven not to be the case?
Well, Professor Aaron Kanani, Professor Mark Siegler, who was an ex-CIA officer, who actually came up with conveyor belt, Professor David Miller from Bath University, have all completely rubbished this. There's no empirical evidence for this conveyor belt theory. But the longer that we trudge along with it, exactly as John said, we're going to make people feel that their basic core identity is a danger, and that's going to push them more into radicalisation and put us more at risk.
Kerry, not all of our viewers will know what the conveyor belt theory is. Can you tell us what exactly is meant by it?
Okay, so the conveyor belt theory is basically the principle that as you become more religious, as you become practicing, you keep a beard or you wear a hijab, that you're going, and this is the phrase that David Cameron uses, that you're going to the doorstep of violence. And then it's only a little step to go through and become violent. The fact of the matter is, this whole concept, this whole idea has been demolished in academia. It's been demolished by even the current head of the CIA, Paul Brennan, has said that the primary factor behind terrorism is our foreign policy. So you have the security services, you have academia, and you have civil society all saying the same thing. But David Cameron's there with his fingers in his ear saying, I know better.
Brother Abdur Raheem, why is there so much focus on ideology when there are so many that are saying it's just not the case?
Well, I mean, I'll be totally frank, and my belief is, and I've been saying it for a long time, is that really Islam offers the only viable alternative to the present, if you want to call it philosophical or political or social, the whole idea materialism, that, you know, life is fulfilled through indulging in your whims and desires and fancies by consuming various goods. The whole basis on which the consumer society rests, which of course all the corporations are, you know, making money out of people's misery, basically. There's not very many alternative ideas out there that really could have a big impact against such a concept, and Islam is one of them, and it's proving ever more popular. People's lives are being transformed, and people find that there is a different way of living other than having to be a mindless consumer. And at the end of the day, the Conservatives, or this particular present Conservative government, seems to me a full-on supporter of the neocon ideology, which is really beholden to the multinational corporations. So I think they've quite rightly identified the battleground. To be fair, at least they know who their enemy is.
But Abdur, there is a threat, right? The government has got to take some measures to try and tackle what they see as a major threat to the public.
Yeah, but this goes where, I mean, first of all, the point is that, as the brothers quite rightly pointed out, there is no evidence that ideology leads to terrorism. The evidence is quite different. So this idea that the ideology of Islam leads, or Islamism as they call it, which is becoming bigger and bigger. Now, I mean, anyone who believes in Khilafah, anyone who thinks Islam, you know, believes you have a religious worldview, this is what they're including now, a religious worldview, you are an extremist, or you're on the door, you're opening the doors to extremism. I mean, this is really basically almost every single Muslim you can imagine, except those people who have such a warped and liberal idea of Islam. Most normal Muslims wouldn't be able to recognize it as Islam at all. So really, the polemic coming out of Cameron really seems to be against the generality of Islam and Muslims. It's not, you know, and as the other guest pointed out, sorry, I forgot his name, he said this is targeting the whole Muslim community. It clearly is. It's very wide and comprehensive, and very sad and unnerving to hear our Prime Minister talk like this.
John, another theme I want to bring in before we do have to move on is the grievance justification. Prime Minister David Cameron brought it up today, where he said it has to be challenged, this idea that because of the Iraq war, because of what might be happening in conflict zones around the world, that somehow this can be a causal factor to extremist ideology or acts of terror. He mentioned 9/11. He said, for example, the 9/11 happened before the Iraq war. What do you make of what he said in that regard?
Well, the history of the Middle East didn't begin at 9/11. Western intervention in that region has been a long and inglorious one, going back decades. And it's involved 13 years of sanctions against Iraq, predating 9/11, which resulted in the deaths of 2 million people. 500,000 of those children are under the age of 5. It's resulted in the Western policy of supporting Israel's occupation and colonization of Palestine and Palestinian land, ethnic cleansing. It's propping up dictators and so forth. So this predates 9/11. So these people can only think in a clock that goes back to 9/11. But what I found particularly offensive, if I may, about the speech was when he prayed and aid Western, so-called Western values as values to aspire to. I'm somebody who's from a Western background, and I reject completely every Western value that David Cameron and his ilk support. This is these are values of violence and death and occupation and gross injustice, both at home and abroad.
Kerry, final words before we have to move on to our next segment. For Cage, who have been named in the Prime Minister's speech today, anything going forward?
Well, Cage have been under the spotlight for a long time now. And we're going forward. We've got the judicial review coming up against the Charity Commission. We're in court on Thursday. And this won't silence us. They thought they buried us, but really we were seeds. Cage will keep on coming back.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us for this segment. We are going to have to move on. We have run out of time for this segment. But we'll be back after the break to take a look at the rest of the day's news and what's been trending on Twitter. Join us then.